Thanks everybody for joining in. We will be getting started shortly. Thanks all for joining in. I'm the disembodied voice of Jeff Abramson. We're just getting started now. I will join and get us started very soon, but I'm really delighted for this pending conversation. Good afternoon and good morning to those who are joining in. My name is Jeff Abramson. I'm going to go ahead and do some of the preliminaries so we can get started right away. Really delighted you could join us for challenges and opportunities posed by new technologies and innovation in small arms and light weapons control. Once again, I'm Jeff Abramson. I'm the director of the Forum on the Arms Trade. The Forum on the Arms Trade is a network of experts who work on the security, human rights, and other issues related to arms trade, security assistance, and weapons use. We are a group of about 200 people of experts and emerging experts who are emerging experts are people who are sort of new in their career, and being part of the forums program gives them an opportunity to meet each other, work on their own work, and really delighted that today's session is actually led and inspired by one of our emerging experts, Mona Lisa Hazarika, who will be introduced in a second and really be running the show. So I'm mostly here to welcome you and tell you a little bit more about the technology we'll be using. I know everybody has done a bazillion Zoom webinars at this point. For our webinars, we like to engage the audience as much as possible. So you will find that the chat is open. You are free as audience members to chat with each other as long as you keep it respectful. This is a place for sharing ideas. Obviously, there's a lot of viewpoints, but please use that chat respectfully. But we will not be using the chat for the Q&A. So you will also find that there is a Q&A enabled. Please feel free to add your Q&A questions there. You can also see each other's questions, and it's actually very helpful if you vote for the questions you most want to hear about so that when we get to the Q&A portion, we know what is of most interest to the audience members. So you may upvote the Q&A questions. And also just the last bit of technology at the end, when you leave, you'll be taken to a very quick survey that gives us a little bit of feedback about the event. We'd love it if you would fill in that survey so we have some sense of what worked, what didn't work, and what you liked. But with that, actually, I am delighted to turn this over to Mona Lisa Hazarika, who this is her area of specialty. She's been researching this topic for quite a while. She brought together this panel. I'm actually looking forward to learning a ton from the panelists and from Mona Lisa. So Mona Lisa, over to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Jeff. Greetings, everyone. My name is Mona Lisa Hazarika, and it's my privilege to moderate today's webinar on challenges and opportunities posed by new technologies and innovation in small arms and light weapons control. As we navigate the 21st century, technological advancements such as 3D printing, modular weapons design, polymer components, and the proliferation of online platforms has transformed the landscape of small arms and light weapons manufacturing and distribution. These innovations present both significant challenges and unique opportunities for arms control and regulations. Our discussion today aims to delve into these complexities, exploring how international regulatory instruments and national practices can adapt to the evolving technological environment. We are honored to have with us a distinguished panel of experts who bring a wealth of knowledge and experience to this critical discussion. Joining us today are Matilda Vecchioni, Nicholas Floroquin, and Frida Thomason. Matilda is an associate researcher for the Conventional Arms and Ammunition Program at the UN Institute for Disarmament Research, UNIDIR. Her work focuses on the craft production of small arms and light weapons and their implication for arms control as well as conflict and armed violence prevention, and the role of arms-related data therein. Nicholas is the head of data and analytics, as well as a senior researcher at Small Arms Survey. He is involved in research on illicit flow of arms and ammunition in a range of regions, most recently in West and North Africa, Latin America and the Caribbean, Europe, and Ukraine. Frida is a political affairs officer in the Conventional Arms Branch of the UN Office for Disarmament Affairs in New York, where she focuses on the program of action on small arms and light weapons and other policy developments on small arms and light weapons and assist states in implementing such frameworks. Matilda and Nicholas will be joining us for the first round of discussions, and Frida will be leading the discussion on the open-ended technical expert group, which we will get to in a while. With that, I would first like to invite Matilda and Nicholas for the first round of questions on emerging technologies and the illicit weapons production. If that's okay, I would first like to start with you, Matilda. If you could tell our audience as to what extent does the rise of technologies such as 3D printing and modular weapon systems pose challenges for detecting and preventing illicit small arms and light weapons proliferation? Matilda, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mona Lisa, and it's very nice to be here today. Yeah, I'll get right into the first question. Well, I think it goes without saying that, of course, as you said, technological advancements have brought significant changes in the field of weapons production and in the field of civilian firearms market, be it with modular weapons a long time ago now, actually, and removable core components, and with latest advancements in hybrid designs of 3D printed weapons. So I think it's safe to say by now that, I mean, the production of this weapon is significantly cheaper, better, more sophisticated, and easier to acquire than it was 10 years ago, I would say. And this is for different reasons. I mean, starting with these weapons rely less on firearm-specific components. The materials are getting easier to acquire, cheaper in some cases. They have simpler techniques of manufacturing. And so the potential audience of this is enlarging. To answer your question, I think a good starting point is probably to understand how these weapons differ from those that originally existing frameworks were sort of designed to regulate, be it the POA, be it the ITI or the Firearms Protocol, and we'll talk about this more later. The first consideration is quite basic, is of course on materials of production, and this again is not new. I think thermoplastics, commercial filaments, polymers have been around for a while in the arms manufacturing industry. We know that they pose challenges to marking because marking on polymers is easier to remove. We know that they pose challenges on detection. Clearly, detecting a polymer component, even it's significantly harder than when it is a metal component. In the case of illicit manufacturing, clearly this poses significant challenges. Now I get to the second point, which I think is the most distinctive of the issue of craft production or non-industrial production, do-it-yourself production, however we want to call it, is that it is entirely decentralized by nature. The production or the assembly oftentimes sits with the illicit end user. I know that in some cases, producers and users are not the same individual, but it is highly decentralized in that sense. The acquisition of components is relatively easy. And therefore, that by nature is very different from what most instruments regulate, which is, illicit trafficking, preventing diversion of legal weapons into the illicit sphere. It is completely different than regulating something that has never really been in the legal production sphere. They also pose challenges to investigations and tracing. Most of them come without serial number or with falsified serial numbers. So clearly that is a challenge. And then I would say to ballistic analysis, of course, because they do not produce the same ballistic traces as a conventional weapon would. And then let me close on a last point, which I think is fundamental here, is that we're not only looking at full devices, we're not only looking at the firearm, but we're also looking at components, which are more and more trafficked across borders, be it in parcels, through postal shipment, concealed in other commercial items. We see the proliferation of materials, of technologies, and of knowledge, of know-how. And I would say that the peculiarity here is that the barriers to access all of these have probably never been lower. There is a very active and skilled community, and most of the ecosystem is online, with platforms guiding the production from point A until the very end, and even the use in some cases or the trafficking. And this clearly changes the nature of the challenge. It guides us to rethink really what are we trying to regulate, what are we trying to control, what is proliferating. And I think there is a need to think beyond the firearm. And this also then goes into the direction of which actors are relevant to this discussion. And I know we'll have a chance to speak about this more later, so I won't go in depth, but I think it enlarges significantly the amount of actors that become stakeholders in the life cycle of this type of weapons. And I'll stop here, mindful of the time, and I give you back the floor.
Thank you, Matilda, for your insights on the nuances of new illicit weapons technology, but also on your point on how there are a variety of actors involved in the process. Moving on to you, Nicholas, if you could tell us in what ways are non-state actors, including organized crime groups and armed insurgents, exploiting these technological advancement in small arms and light weapons production and trafficking?
Thank you, Mona Lisa. So maybe let me start by first explain where we come from on this subject. I mean, basically, working with the Small Arms Survey, we've been doing sort of regional studies and assessments on illicit weapons in a range of settings, range of regions across the world for a couple of decades now. And I think what's been really striking is that there's been a big shift, especially in the last 10 years, in terms of the weight of a growing variety of privately made weapons or non-industrial weapons being used in different parts of the world, both in terms of the quantities, but also in terms of the level of sophistication. And so, when we were first looking at this at the very beginning, when some of the international instruments were being negotiated, it was really more of a marginal issue. It was mainly about artisanal firearms. And it was concentrated in a couple of regions where, there were issues, but it was not across the board like today, where we're seeing issues in virtually all regions. So I think that's the first point. The other one is it's actually still hard to quantify because the data is very hard to collect. A number of these newer generations of privately made weapons are made to look very closely like real industrial weapons. In fact, some are deliberate replicas that in some cases are hard to distinguish even for experts from the real models. And so there's a lot of miscategorization, a lot of misreporting. So it's actually hard to show this shift. But certainly, through our work in different parts of the world, we've seen some of this. So I'll just cite a few examples that I think show the shift. I mean, there's obviously, a big subject at the moment is the use of weaponized small drones in virtually all the major conflicts at the moment, both by state actors, but also interest amongst non-state actors, not just insurgent groups, but also certain cartel organizations in Latin America, for example. We also know that IEDs, improvised explosive devices, have become the primary cause of casualties in some parts of the world. For example, in the conflicts of the Sahel, where they accounted for as many as 60% of casualties among peacekeepers up until 2019, when the data was still available. And I think when you get to firearms, and particularly 3D printing firearms, which is one of the topics that is raising a lot of concerns at the moment, we're seeing reports from now most regions of different actors either printing them or seizures of these weapons from different actors, including non-state armed groups, including extremist actors, and including lone individuals. And the way these weapons are used, so they're used by armed groups in online propaganda, for example. They're used to repair industrial weapons in conflict zones, but they've also been used in attacks in, for example, countries such as Myanmar, with the purpose of acquiring and seizing more military equipment from the enemy. And there's also been, as you know, some high-profile assassinations, for example, that of the healthcare CEO in New York recently. I think it's also, when you look at other categories of firearms, privately made firearms, there's also good data now coming out of Europe showing for the US and Europe, showing the scale of the phenomenon. The ATF in the US in its last report reported more than 27,000 seized PMFs or recovered PMFs for 2023. That's a significant number. In some European countries, seizures of converted firearms, which is a different type of PMF, but one that has caused a lot of headaches in Europe. In some countries, reach up to 40% of annual seizures. We have a problem in Europe at the moment with counterfeit firearms. One country reported that up to 1/3 of its seizures of 9mm handguns were counterfeits. And so basically, I think these statistics show that we really are in a different situation now, where across regions there is increased access to different types of these weapons. Many of them are more sophisticated than previous generations and are more reliable and potentially deadly. And so I think the picture has greatly changed within the space of 20-25 years in this respect.
Thank you, Nicholas, for sharing that wide range of work that has been done at Small Arms Survey, but also highlighting the current limitations of quantifying non-industrial weapons due to the current lack of data. For the second round of questions, I think it would be interesting for our audience to discuss the recent developments in the arms control space. Nicholas, if I may come back to you, my question is in relation to the main regulatory gaps or loopholes in the current international and national small arms and light weapons control framework when it comes to emerging manufacturing technologies. Please, the floor is yours.
Thanks. So I think the first aspect is that it's linked to what I just said, that basically the international norms created in 2001, either through the UN Program of Action of the Firearms Protocol, were done when this issue of new technologies and privately made firearms was quite marginal. And so when you read the texts, I mean, production is basically mentioned in terms of states having to exercise effective controls over production to prevent basically trafficking and diversion. It's a bit of a binary vision of production. Either production is industrial and legal, or it's illicit. And I think what we're seeing now in the current environment is that there are many different scenarios in terms of firearms production. We actually have some illicit industrial sort of scale production in some cases, but we also have some sort of gray area, you could call it gray production, where in certain regions, for example, West Africa has a lot of experience with trying to regulate the craft production of the firearms sector, since its convention allowed states to do that back in 2007. And so you have also that type of situation where you have much smaller scale production that is done by individuals, smaller workshops, that is pretty much legal, but where the regulations are still tailored for sort of industrial actors, requiring registration, requiring markings. There's also concerns, obviously, with safety of these products, etc. So that's one thing is, is there another need to recognize that the production actors have changed and the dynamics are much more complex than just the binary industrial, legal versus illicit. That's the first point. I think the second point, which Mathilde has already mentioned, is one of the main international and national instruments for investigating illicit firearms is the serial number. It's tracing. It's looking at the number, a unique serial number on a seized weapon, and going back the chain to identify the last legal producer. Now, what we're seeing with most of these privately made firearms, and thank you, Jeff, for reminding everyone that PMF is privately made firearm. I'll try to say the whole thing in the future. Basically, most of these privately made firearms do not have a serial number, or if they do, they're either fake or they're actually even more problematic. They can be replicas of real serial numbers. So this basically means that for this growing proportion of illicit weapons that are privately made, traditional tracing procedures and sort of strategies cannot work. It doesn't mean tracing cannot be done. Tracing can be done through forensic analysis, through examination of these weapons, the parts used, the methods, the approaches, other traces that are left on these weapons. But there needs to be a recognition that tracing cannot no longer be limited only to the serial number, basically, especially for these categories of weapons. And I think the third and last point that I would like to make is that international instruments tend to focus on preventing diversion from the legal to the illicit. Mathilde already mentioned that this doesn't apply in a scenario where an organized armed group or an insurgent group is able to produce high quality weapons on its own. So how do we tackle this issue and try to think more about ways to prevent illicit access by unauthorized actors to these categories of weapons? It's a new thinking is needed that is much broader than just the concept of diversion.
Thank you, Nicholas, for sharing your insights on how much craft production has evolved over the years. Matilda, if I may, UNIDIR has a series of publications on assessing technologies to counter diversion of small arms and light weapons as part of its detect work. I was wondering if you could share with us how law enforcement and arms control authorities can leverage technologies, may that be 2D codes, chemical encoding, Internet of Things, or distributed ledger technology, DLT, to enhance the detection of diverted illicit small arms and light weapons?
Yes, sure. Thank you, Mona Lisa. I think this is actually a very good question because it allows us to take a break from challenges and look a bit at opportunities, which is also something that we'll have to do and is an expectation at the OATG. So I think it's a good opportunity to look at that. Of course, generally, technologies can offer significant benefits in the field of arms control, be it for marking or tracking of movements, data collection purposes, etc. In the case of UNIDIR, as you rightly said, we've looked at technologies and their applicability in the context of preventing diversion. So as Nick reminded us, is the licit part of the small arms and light weapons. And I think this is important to note. This research didn't look into illicit small arms and light weapons, but those that risk of being diverted. Now, we've looked into 14 technologies, and you're lucky enough, I won't go through all 14, but you've mentioned a couple. So you've mentioned 2D codes, for instance, and for those of you that are not aware, 2D codes, the most common type is a QR code, for instance. They're a relatively simple technology that most people are familiar with. And the utility of it is that they store significantly more information than a 1D code, so a barcode, for instance. So they could come at end in, for instance, item level identification, right? They could store more info about a small arms and light weapon, they can increase accountability, and they can potentially support tracing and tracking of that weapon. And here I would like to mention a first point regarding, how to leverage and what to think of when leveraging these technologies. They do not all serve the same purpose at the same time of a life cycle of a weapon. So for instance, in our case, we looked at technologies that could support pre-export or transfer or post-delivery, and they are not all equally relevant at all steps. So one important thing when thinking of technologies in this sphere is that this thinking is needs-driven, that we understand what law enforcement authorities are needing the technology for, and it shouldn't just be for the sake of the technology is available and hence I use it. So if this is needed for item level identification, 2D codes could be an option, for instance, or different types of marking. It could be required for record keeping, or it could be required, for instance, for authentication of certificates. I'm thinking now of end user certificates, for instance. So this is one of the aspects to consider. The second aspect to consider, I feel, is technologies in this field come with opportunities and again come with challenges and barriers. So again, in the case of 2D codes, as I said, they're a simple technology, which means that potentially states that have lower capacity can relatively easily implement it. They probably have the tools. It has been tested already on firearms. But it also comes with doubts, right? During our research, some doubts were raised about, does it really add value compared to existing marking, or is it more easily removable, or does it really save me time because you still need to scan all the QR codes nevertheless? So I think, there is a need to think of these barriers, and the barriers increase with technologies that are by nature harder to implement. So you have mentioned DLT, which is distributed ledger technology. So that is on the higher end of the implementation scale. And that is because it needs a much broader infrastructure. So the idea is that different distributed network of users could input information about a SALW, small arms and light weapons, across its life cycle at different points in a ledger, which is, to put it simple, sort of a neutral space, a distributed network across these different users. This could increase accountability, transparency, could help you, know where the weapon was at different stages of its life. It needs a bigger infrastructure. It needs that information to be logged in regularly, consistently, a sufficient amount of information by all the stakeholders involved. Which brings me to the last point on which I will wrap up, which is the use of these technologies need to be aware of the context of applicability of the technology. Technologies need capacity, they need infrastructure, they need sometimes specific geographic conditions. So when implementing it, we really need to be aware of how easy to use they are, how affordable, how sustainable, if there is a regulatory framework in place that could support the implementation of that technology, or at what level we're looking at, national, regional, international. So all these questions are to be asked. There is another 12 technologies, but for that, I invite you, Mona Lisa, also to share the resources with colleagues that could take a look at the different levels that we analyzed. Thank you.
Thank you, Matilda. The applicability of 2D codes and DLD was definitely very interesting to know, but also your point on the need for capacity building among stakeholders to actually implement it. Moving on to the international efforts and best practices that are currently in place, both of you mentioned the importance of information sharing and lessons learned among actors. And following up on that, Matilda, what role should international cooperation and information sharing play in adopting regulatory and operational responses to evolving technological threats in the small arms and light weapons domain?
Thanks. Yeah, I think on this, I'll build on my first point, which is the craft production, non-industrial production is a highly decentralized issue. And in these terms, any solution or measure requires effective international cooperation. And it requires so from a much larger spectrum of actors, as I said, beyond sort of the more traditional stakeholders in the arms control sphere. Of course, governments, law enforcement, international organizations, industry, civil society, they all remain key to any solution that we would like to craft. But there are other actors. There are social media platforms that are coming into play. There are, as I mentioned, postal shipping companies. There are border control and custom authorities, of course. And these are becoming more and more relevant within this conversation. So I would start by saying that. In terms of what international cooperation can do, I think first of all, it can contribute to a more shared global understanding or discourse around this issue. As Nick said, I think it is highly diverse. It looks, at least for now, different across regions, across countries, probably. But it has a global configuration. It has a transnational nature. And probably it will evolve, and some things will come into regions that don't necessarily document it for now. So the idea is, without neglecting the variety of the issue, is really to push a bit for this global understanding of how the issue is transnational. This would then feed into the regulatory point, which Nick raised, which is there has been recent progress, as Frida can attest, in the context of the UN Program of Action and the most recent review conference. But, compared to the technical knowledge out there on these weapons, regulatory frameworks are quite lagging behind. And there is a gap that is undeniable in terms of regulating what is out there right now, which clearly poses challenges. There have been efforts at the regional, sub-regional, and national level, which are commendable, and I think go in the direction of at least regulating the issue that applies to their country or region, which in some cases can be, for instance, 3D printing, blueprints, etc. And I think there is probably a need to make sure that implementation is possible. And when something comes from the regional level, that actually, this trickles down at the national level. And this doesn't only speak to 3D printing, it could speak to convertible weapons and many other types of craft production. A third point is more operational, which is what you've mentioned, Mona Lisa, in terms of information sharing. And as Nick said, the need for data, simply, and to make sure that the law enforcement has the capacity to collect that data. I think law enforcement has been doing incredible efforts in this sense, in bringing together more and more data on this issue. And I think there is a need to get more of disaggregated data and centralized data shared across agencies, shared across countries and across regions where possible, to really understand trends, to understand how this issue is evolving, and what could trickle down across different regions. And then I wrap up on a final point, which is more conceptual, but I think it's also where research and academia can play a role within the network of international cooperation. We need an understanding of actors. We need an understanding of users, of producers, of drivers, because this is an issue that has significant ideological, economic, social, cultural connotations. This is not only the case for more ideological movements in the West, but it's also the case for Africa, West Africa, as Nick mentioned. So I think it is important to understand these, because without it, we'll always have a bit of a partial understanding of the challenges in front of us. So yes, I close it here. I hope I was within the time, and I give you back the floor.
Yeah, thank you, Matilda. Exactly on time. Indeed, establishing a global understanding on the issues is the sine qua non of the work that we do. Nicholas, I had a question for you on the safeguards and technological standard that could be established to ensure that these advancements in dual-use technologies do not inadvertently facilitate illicit small arms and light weapons activities. So yeah, Nicholas, over to you.
Thank you. So I think there are a lot of initiatives in different domains that are relevant here. But I think the important thing is to think of these safeguards from a strategic perspective, and to not sort of get lost in this very narrow initiative that might miss the bigger picture. So that's I think the first point is to try to be holistic. And in this regard, I'd like to maybe refer our participants to a nice paper that our colleague Yannick Veilleux-Lepage wrote recently, where he advocates, for example, for adopting a design against crime approach to the issue of 3D printing of firearms. And that basically involves incorporating crime prevention into the different systems and products that are involved in 3D printing so that they can help prevent the printing of illicit items. So that can include, for example, embedding tech in the computer or slicer software, as well as in the 3D printer software that can detect whether the user is trying to print a firearm. It can also involve having the printer leaving a signature on the printed product that would allow, in the case of a printed product being used in a crime, that the manufacturing printer can be identified. And some of these techniques are actually already being used, for example, for preventing the printing of counterfeit currency, for example. So it's something that's already been done in other sectors. There's also the possibility to work on the filament. I mean, there's interesting forensic work already being done to try to, trace or create a link between a 3D printed product and seize the printer, for example. So there's already some quite promising work, based on forensics. But there's also further opportunities offered by chemical tagging technologies that could be embedded into the filaments, and that could also provide some good traceability. So obviously all these ideas, they also depend on the industry, either voluntarily adopting such measures or the regulators adopting regulations to enforce such systems. And both of these might take time or might suffer some pushback, but still, I think these can contribute to raising the bar for the production of 3D printers, for example, 3D printed firearms, and can be useful. I think more broadly, though, it's also important to look back at experiences learned from trying to tackle other types of privately made firearms. And for example, I mentioned, West Africa has been trying to regulate craft production, so small-scale craft production that would be registered, that will be authorized for some years now. So there's experiences there that can be learned from. In the European context, there's at least 10 years of, if not more, 10, 15 years now of efforts to try to contain the illicit conversion of firearms, with some successes. I think on the regulatory side now, European member states have succeeded in decreasing the issue of converted, so reactivated firearms, converted Flaubert firearms, these kinds of weapons. So that was successful, it seems, primarily through the revision of the Firearms Directive and new regulatory measures, and a strong push for member states to implement these measures. There's less success, however, with converted alarm weapons, and there the approach so far has been more about trying to set some manufacturing standards for these alarm weapons, saying yes, they can be sold without restriction, but they need to abide by certain standards. And so far, we're seeing that this is not sufficient to prevent illicit conversion of these items or the proliferation of more of these converted firearms. So I think we also need to look at what this means in terms of learning. Even when things don't work, it's important to understand why and maybe what can be improved. And I think there's actually some interesting parallels in some of these experiences that could serve as food for thought, for trying to think about the newest generations of privately made firearms.
Thank you, Nicholas, for sharing the current opportunities in forensic science for regulating 3D printed weapons, but also the ongoing and past work that's been done in West Africa and among EU member states. As we reflect on what has been discussed so far, I have a final question for you both on the Open-Ended Technical Expert Group, the OETG. For those of you who are not aware, at the fourth review conference of the UN Programme of Action, UNPOA, Member states in the outcome document not only recognize the impact of illicitly craft manufactured, converted, or privately manufactured small arms like weapons, but also decided to establish an open-ended technical expert group convening within the week of the Biennial Meeting of States in 2026 and 2028 to consider the challenges posed by recent and ongoing developments in weapons manufacturing, technology, and design, and explore potential opportunities to strengthen the implementation of the Program of Action and ITI, which is the International Tracing Instrument. As researcher in this domain, my question to you both is, what priorities or recommendations should be put forward to the OETG to better address the risks posed by new and emerging technologies in small arms light weapons control? Whoever would like to go first.
I can give you a break, Nick, if you want, and then go first. Thank you, Mona Lisa, again. I think in my previous answers, I flagged some of the elements that I think are, worth the attention of states. Of course, it really remains entirely up to them to set the priorities for this group. What I can share is probably what UNIDIR is aiming to do, and in support of the preparations towards the OETG, and also in support of the ACE colleagues. I think, as I mentioned, there is a need to bridge the gap between the knowledge that exists nowadays in research and forensics in the technical community and the diplomatic community and the policy realm. So I think UNIDIR is very much willing to provide that space where appropriate, and bring these together to make sure that the gap is covered a bit in advance of the open-ended technical expert group, and we get there with a good knowledge of how the issue looks nowadays, how it has evolved, a bit of what we've covered here and more. So first and foremost, I think we're looking forward to bridging a bit that gap in preparation to the OETG. Secondly, I think there is a need to hear more from the states that have been actively implementing regulations in this field, or that have been supporting operational work to improve measures to address the issue of craft production. There have been states that are active, and I think it is good to provide space for them to share good practices, effective measures, lessons learned from an operational standpoint, so that this can also be borrowed by other regions, and so that exchange is kept active also in advance of the group of experts. So yeah, I think UNIDIR is hopefully well placed to provide that space. And so we really look forward to cooperating with ODA and partners towards that. Do I give the floor directly to Nick? Do I take away the moderation role from you? Great. Nick, you have the floor.
Thanks. Well, I think a couple of thoughts on what a body like this open-ended technical expert group could look at. And I think as we discussed, there's technical solutions out there, and they're very interesting, and there's a lot being tried in different regions. But there's definitely a need to share information on lessons learned, what works in certain contexts, what doesn't work, and to filter this information and share it more globally. So I think through such a mechanism, this could be a good way to do that. So far, there's been a few international conferences, but that were organized more by European actors that did some of that. But I think now, if that can be done at a global level, that would be quite positive. I would also stress that there's a need to reach out or take into consideration what is happening in other UN processes. There's, the firearms protocol falls under the UN Convention on Transnational Organized Crime, which the conference of which adopted a resolution last year, Resolution 12.3, that includes a number of recommendations already that deal with the impact of new technology and new generations of weapons, including recommendations regarding the regulation of 3D printed firearm blueprints, the need for specialized training, not just for law enforcement, but also for regulators, the need to develop capacities to detect and investigate privately made firearms, and also recommendations on information sharing. So there is already some discussions there too. And the firearms protocol coming from a law enforcement perspective. I think the UN Program of Action historically coming more from a conflict prevention perspective. There's a lot of exchange that can happen that can be fruitful. And to be honest, I think there's no choice but to cooperate and share, and synergize some of these processes, because the pace of the developments that we're seeing with privately made firearms is so fast that you need the global actors also to react fast and to basically mutualize resources and action. So I think that's an important point. Another important and interesting aspect that this resolution 12.3 notes is the need for a multi-dimensional whole of government approach. And so Mathilde has already explained how it has to involve law enforcement, has to involve forensics, research can play a role, regulators are very important, technology, fast, parcel companies, etc. I think, in light of research that has shown that there's growing interest, growing appeal for these new technologies amongst new categories of actors that traditionally would not necessarily thought as being interested in or getting involved in small arms crime. It seems like also other sectors of governments might also be relevant to try to bring to the discussion. I'm thinking, for example, of a recent study that just came out actually yesterday by another colleague, Ruben, who spent part of his report talking about the appeal of these weapons for youth in particular. And so there's these sort of groups, and also this niche political groups that also are interested in these technologies. So what is driving the demand for these specific new types of firearms amongst these new groups, and what can be done in terms of understanding that demand and in terms of prevention, and especially when you're thinking about youth, other types of national agencies should probably be involved. And then I think my last point will be that obviously, the open-ended technical expert group will meet twice normally in 2026, 2028, but the issue is not going to go away after that. It's going to be very important to keep an eye on new developments, even beyond the work of the open-ended technical expert group. And so it will be good that it reflects on the best way to, on a regular basis, capture these, the new data on what is happening, the latest trends, and also the experiences that different regions are trying to implement to try to tackle these issues, and what are successes, what are failures, what is the learning. So I think there needs to also be consideration of how to make such reflections more permanent, and give the international community the means to be much more responsive, and and to anticipate also some of these developments. Thank you.
Thank you, Matilda. Thank you, Nicholas, for your very insightful and perceptive answers. I would now like to invite our distinguished speaker from UNODA, Ms. Frida Thomason, who has graciously accepted to speak on the open-ended technical expert group. Frida, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mona Lisa, and thanks to Jeff and the Forum on the Arms Trade, and everyone for organizing this webinar, and for inviting us to speak from UNODA. And it's been really interesting to listen out to UNIDIR and Small Arms Survey, and also following the discussions from all participants here. So I'll speak a little bit about the way forward for the global discussions in the United Nations on the new developments in small arms technology, manufacturing, and design in the context of the Program of Action on Small Arms and Light Weapons and the Open-ended Technical Expert Group.
Frida, sorry to interrupt you real fast.
Yes.
Could you just speak a little bit louder?
Of course. Is this
Thank
better?
you. That's better. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Of course, let me know if it's not enough. So I was saying that it's been about a year since the fourth review conference on the program of action, the RevCon 4, took place in New York at the UN in June 2024. And states did adopt an outcome document by consensus, which is a quite significant achievement, especially in today's quite complex geopolitical environment, where new initiatives are quite difficult to agree on. But at that time, states did reaffirm that the program of action and the international tracing instrument must evolve, much to the discussions we've had already today. And states also recognize the growing risks posed by weapons that are illicitly manufactured or using technologies or methods not yet recognized by these frameworks. But also recognize the need to look into the opportunities of these developments and to bring them into the POA and the international tracing instrument. So one of the most important outcomes was the decision to establish this new open-ended technical expert group, or the OETG, on developments in technology, manufacturing, and design of small arms and light weapons. And that group is the result of over a decade-long dialogue and negotiation in the context of the POA. Since 2011, states have raised concerns about new materials, modular designs, digital manufacturing, and methods that complicate marking and record keeping in the discussions on the program of action. Then in 2018, 2021, and again in 2022, at the Biennial Meeting of States, they continue discussing how to better address these developments, and the idea of this technical expert group gained more traction, and the decision was then finally made in 2024 last year. And the General Assembly went ahead and adopted a resolution to establish this group, which has a quite clear mandate, which is that it will convene during the 9th and 10th Biennial Meeting of States on the program of action, which will be in 2026 and 2028. For between 2 and 3 days each time. So that means that the first time the group will actually meet is in the first week of June 2026, so 1 year from now. Participation will be open to all member states with a strong encouragement to include the relevant technical experts as representatives on those delegations. The chair of the group will be empowered to invite briefings from industry, civil society, academia, and these will be also able to hold online so that we can make sure that there's representation also for those who may not be able to travel to New York at that time. What the group will really produce is agreed recommendations by consensus, and these are to be considered either by the BMS 10, the Biennial Meeting of States, in 2028, or latest in 2030 by the 5th Review Conference. So the time frame is quite long, but will also require a lot of negotiation and a solid kind of intersessional program. What the actual recommendations will be, we of course don't know yet. States have discussed the potential of a supplementary annex to the ITI or the POA as a potential output. But on the other hand, as I think we also just heard, even also from Nicholas and others, that it's also important to maintain kind of flexible arrangements as these technologies continue to emerge constantly. A chair of the group is not yet appointed. It's expected that any interested member states of the UN can come forward to chair the group, and that will be kind of the first, really the first step for that work to fully begin once there is a chair of the group. And Matilda and Nicholas have covered a lot of the substantive issues that we expect that the Open and Technical Expert Group will address. I mean, we've heard some of these challenges, like the materials that are used to produce weapons and how they are changing, like So like polymer is one point that will be that have been coming up a lot in the discussions in new material that makes it more difficult to mark small arms and light weapons using the traditional marking methods. But the group will also discuss modular weapons that can be assembled from interchangeable parts, and the difficulties tracing around that. But also, of course, new ways of producing. Explicitly in the mandate is the need to look at 3D printed small arms and light weapons that are more likely to be produced outside of the regulated supply chains, and also or often without serial numbers or unique identifying features. I think other challenges that have come up in today's event, of course, is the variety of actors involved, the non-industrial producers, the broader issue of privately manufactured weapons, as Nicholas spoke about, as well as conversion and difficulties monitoring. But also what the open-ended technical expert group will do is to really look, and I think that's what we just heard from the recommendations, to look at the opportunities. And as Matilda laid for, there are many solutions that comes from innovation and evolving technologies, at least 14, including the QR codes for tracing, tracking, digital record keeping methods, and other methods that the technical expert group can explore. And what it will also have to do is to consider how to really bridge the capacity and technological gaps between states. For example, states that have more advanced forensic and regulatory capabilities, and those that are still building that infrastructure. And I think that was also a clear recommendation that we heard right now, that it's that will need to be kind of key and for the success of the group. And that also brings me to another point, that for this open-ended technical expert group to succeed, it must be inclusive and not only with a variety of actors, but also considering gender balance delegations. We know already in this the meetings on disarmament at the United Nations are already struggling to close the participation gender gaps, and especially when adding the point of bringing really the technical field, where we know that there's also women's underrepresentation is even larger. I think that will be a big, quite a big focus for the open-ended technical expert group to ensure that that all voices are heard. And also what Nicholas just put forward on also engaging young professionals, hearing voices from young people too that are often affected by or involved in the issues that will be discussed by the group. But also for having a broad kind of civil society, industry actors as partners, of course, and working closely with states. Just to note that there are no rules of procedures adopted for the open-ended technical expert group yet, but the mandate is clear that the chair should invite relevant subject matter experts from civil society, academia, private sector, industry. And also, I think a priority for UNODA will also be to ensure that all states, especially most affected, can participate also through sponsorships and capacity building. So in terms of next steps, we, as I mentioned, it's really identifying a chair, having someone come forward to share the group. Once that is appointed, the preparations will accelerate. And we do anticipate also a set of intersessional expert seminars, virtual consultations, and thematic discussions to really build that momentum ahead of June 2026. So for member states, I think the really first step is to identify and prepare technical experts. Also, as we heard from Mathilde and Nicholas, also to the recommendation to take that whole of government approach, see who is best placed within governments also to be part of those discussions. And also for states to really share and come with good practices around the regulatory frameworks that already exist and to share what has been done. also to other partners, civil society, industry. The expertise is really essential to understand the technologies, both challenges and opportunities. So that will also be key in convening dedicated discussions with the chair and with states, both ahead and during those meetings. And just to everyone, I think what's being done here today, continue those expert and discussions, developing the substantive inputs, working papers, case studies, research, and also what Nicholas mentioned in looking at other what's done in other frameworks like the Firearms Protocol, what recommendations can be brought in. So yeah, just in conclusion, I think the more informed the discussions will be ahead, the more powerful the outcomes of the group can be. So I'll end there and over to you, Mona Lisa. Thank you.
Thank you, Frida, for outlining the mandate of the OETG, but also the way forward. Your remarks have definitely enriched our understanding of the group, and we believe it will be highly beneficial for all our participants who have joined us today, but also who will be looking at the recording later on. With that, I would now like to open the floor to questions from our audience. Please use the Q&A feature to submit your questions, and we will address as many as time permits. I believe we have a few lined up already, and I invite all our speakers to look at the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen to take a look at the questions, and please feel free to jump in.
Hey, Mona Lisa, I think I see a question on radio frequency identification. I think I can briefly take that and then also open the floor to others. It is indeed a technology in which Unidir's research has looked into. So again, I can share the link in the chat of the report so that you can take a look more. But it is a relatively easy technology to implement. It is already quite used in logistics, mostly in the civilian sector. It consists of a chip, an antenna which is attached to the chip, and then there is an external reader. So the idea is that the data is recorded in the chip, transmitted via the antenna to the reader, external reader. It is a technology that can be used at different stages of the life cycle. So it offers opportunity in terms of marking in the form of RFID tags. But it also, it came up quite a lot in our research that it offers opportunity for physical security and stockpile management, because it would basically allow more frequent checks by scanning multiple tags and then basically not requiring the physical presence and inspection and receiving updates basically from those tags. The cool thing is that some tags can have sort of sensors that monitor also environmental factors, which for stockpile management, it's quite interesting because it can alert of changes in the environment. Of course, there is a risk. One of the risks that came up, beyond, of course, being a bit harder to implement than, for instance, a 2D code. But in the case of stockpile management, one of the risks is that there is, as always, an overtrust in the technology, and then actually fewer physical inspections that would come with their own challenge and potentially lead into errors. So I think this is the couple of thoughts I had on that. But I'll share the report link in the chat so that also you can take a look. Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you, Matilda. Please, Nicholas, the floor is yours.
Apologies. Yeah, I saw the questions, provided a few written answers, but on the issue of the West African experience, so I shared a link where we documented a little bit the experience and the challenges there. I mean, the big picture is that West Africa went from basically trying to ban craft production and realizing that it didn't work everywhere. I mean, it probably worked in some other countries, but there were challenges in others because craft production was deeply entrenched in certain cultural activities. It was a source of income for some marginalized communities, and so it sort of backfired in some areas where traditional, like formerly traditional producers that were not getting involved in crime, were simply producing for demand in relation to hunting or some traditional celebrations, then were obliged basically, had little choice than to, or I guess chose, let's say they chose to continue their activities from a criminal perspective and to sell their weapons illegally to basically survive. So that now there's a more flexible approach with the ECOWAS Convention. It's possible for states to allow such production to occur. But obviously the producers have to be registered, they have to mark their weapons, but there's a lot of challenges in making this operational. Some of these producers live in very remote areas. It's very expensive for them to go register. There's issues around, the safety of their products, obviously, if it's a legal product. So there's a lot of challenges that are coming up that I think are worth also reflecting for other situations as well. On the issue of, and I responded also on the names of companies. I mean, a lot of these are not companies, they're individuals. There are bigger outfits out there that produce, bigger operations that produce illegal weapons. But, I don't think they have any, I don't have any big companies in mind in terms of most of the scenarios. But there's work, trying to identify where these different categories of weapons are seized, and I think we'll be sharing some resources after this webinar where you can see different studies that provide links to publications where you can find some of this information and sort of understand where in the world these different problems have been detected. I think Mathilde wanted to jump in also because UNIDIR published a report that provides information on this as well. Mathilde?
Super briefly, Nick, thanks. Yes, on the where are these weapons produced versus used or both. Last year, UNIDIR published a report that I will share in the chat as well. And we submitted surveys across the globe to different countries to try to understand if craft-produced weapons by different categories, so 3D printed or more rudimentary examples, etc., if they were used in their country or both produced and used. Of course, it's not an easy information to obtain. The data within countries on these weapons is quite fragmented, not necessarily reflective of the dimension of the issue and the volume of the issue. So I'll share the report. You can see a preliminary analysis of where these weapons are either produced, used, or both. Of course, with limitations to the availability of data and, at the country level on these. So yes, thank you, Nick. And I don't know if back to you or to Mona Lisa or Frida.
Yeah, I was just going to answer the question from Aaron on the convertible alarm weapons. I mean, I think what I was trying to explain is that for these categories of weapons, the strategy in Europe has been to raise the manufacturing standards to prevent conversion. So basically to raise the technical barrier in terms of skills needed and the sort of work needed to convert these weapons, that come in their legal form, so as firearms that can only fire blank ammunition, no projectiles, to make them harder to convert, basically. So there's, EU-wide now manufacturing standards that were adopted in 2019. And the hope was that by raising these standards, then it would be much more difficult or impossible to convert these weapons into lethal weapons that can fire bullets, and that this would solve the problem. It seems like this is not sufficient because there's continuing seizures of converted firearms of this kind, including recently produced ones. And so I think what we're seeing now is that some states, are deciding to consider these weapons even if they're not converted, even if they can only shoot blank ammunition, to consider them at least as to at least require that they be declared. So, for example, France recently decided that they should be declared as Category C. So it doesn't mean you need an authorization to buy them, but it means they need to be registered. So the impact of that more regulatory approach is to be seen, but it's that kind of approach that seems to have been more successful with other families of converted firearms, such as deactivated firearms, such as the Flaubert and the acoustic weapons, acoustic expansion weapons families, when the regulations basically require that these weapons be at least declared or classified in their original category. So they basically were recognized as firearms, regardless of whether it's when they were sold legally, they were able to fire a bullet. So I think that's where we stand, on this, is that the manufacturing standards seem to have helped slow the flow, but they were not sufficient. And so then there's potentially a need to reopen discussion on the regulatory side. And some countries are already doing that unilaterally.
Thank you, Nicholas. Frida, I believe there's a question that you can help us answer from Haim Chandra on the awareness of these new technologies. If you have taken a look at the question, please feel free to jump in.
Thank you, Mona Lisa. Happy to do that. Yeah, on the question from Haim Chandra on government's awareness of new technologies and having local laws to deal with them. I think that the general response is that it is quite even, where in some places there are regulations and laws, and in others there aren't. And I think one of the reasons is that the global standards have been quite unclear, and also why the open and the technical expert group is an important development to bring states more to the same page in terms of what regulations are expected or are helpful or does work. And especially in the program of action, which is a universal framework. So it's politically binding, not legally binding, as with some other frameworks, that will still help set the standards. And one reflection also when for the review conference, the fourth review conference last year, when this was a big topic, I think one part of the narrative was often that the challenges around new technologies only applied to some countries and wasn't really a universal issue. I think what was really interesting, at least from personally, was to hear from a lot of states on the different challenges that did come up. I mean, we heard from small island states how they had seized 3D printed weapons. We heard from kind of all those different challenges coming up in quite unexpected places too. So, and I think also in the Q&A chat, Aaron has shared some perspectives on the role of NGOs in this. I think also that civil society does have a really important role in providing advice, expertise to states and advising states, including through research. And that is, I think, also one of the objectives of the open and the technical expert group, to more generally bring the technical expertise closer to the political processes. So hopefully that's will be one of the outcomes too. Thank you. Over.
Would any of the other panelists like to share their thoughts on this? I believe not. Frida covered it pretty well. There is another question from Igor on the applicability of unique ownership markings to small arms and light weapons, and how it represents a critical component of effective registration and data collection. If any of you would like to address that.
I mean, I can jump in on this just to say that I think it's crucial not to forget that industrial firearms need to be should not be forgotten. amidst the amongst this excitement and increasing concern for new threats in terms of illicit production. And so I think the question here is very a very good reminder that there's there's a lot of effort to be done to also implement current international commitments with respect to controlling and preventing diversion of industrially made weapons. And indeed, there's the guidance is there. There's the international tracing instrument. There's serial numbers. There's a lot of experience running registration systems across the world. We were recently involved in a study with some partners who I see are here, reviewing experiences in these registries throughout the European Union. And certainly it's, it's not because there's increasing concerns about illicit production that some of these important measures should be neglected, and certainly the tools exist. So these should really be implemented and yeah, and on the widest scale possible to prevent diversion, which is still, a very important source of illicit weapons as well.
If I just may add a point, Mona-Lisa, I think, yeah, I think indeed a good reminder of those firearms that can and must be marked. I think when it comes to marking, it's also similarly to what I was mentioning in terms of integrating new technologies for marking. Also, most traditional marking, I mean, different marking methods also should be, available and considered depending on capacity, available budget of countries for marking, available machines, the types of firearms, the, I don't know, reliability of the energy supply in certain. So all these considerations are also part of, more traditional marking processes. And I think generally, indeed, a good reminder to also, raise awareness of different methods of marking and, the benefits that they can have and barriers potentially that they can come with. For specific contexts. So yes, on that, back to you or to Frida, if, yeah.
I can maybe add just a couple of words on that. I think you covered, but just to say when it comes to marking, I mean, while the responsibility for marking lays with each government, with each state, we know that the issue of diversion and illicit trafficking goes across borders and beyond. So it is really a global problem or responsibility to ensure the proper marking. And from at least from the UN side, we do, they provide assistance also to states that requested in either building capacities of small arms and weapons commissions in marking techniques, or even very practical assistance in ensuring that the marking machines are working and or help to procure new ones. So, and then I think the other aspect is the continued kind of research in different marking methodologies as well. I can do a little bit of advertisement. Our colleagues, our regional center in Latin America and the Caribbean, will soon be launching a new publication on laser marking and with recommendations. They is also working on a larger study that will be released in 2026 on the issue of obliterated markings. So just a heads up on that. If anyone's interested in that, we're working with Conflict Armament Research, and this is a mandate from states at the review conference to look into the issue of some markings that are being removed and finding techniques for recovery of obliterated or erased markings. So yeah, a bit of commercial. Thank you.
Thank you, Frida, Matilda, and Nicholas. I don't see any questions in the Q&A. And in that case, I would like to invite all of our speakers to share any closing remarks. Please, the floor is yours.
Okay, I can't
go ahead, Matilda.
Clearly. No, I mean, honestly, it's always good to discuss this issue. I think we'll have many more opportunities coming up with the present partners and with you, Mona Lisa. Unidir is very much engaged in the topic. And just to also flag that Nick mentioned it at the very beginning, but there is a lot of work to be done in the linkages with other improvised weapons systems, including explosives, including weaponized drones. So we're looking into that currently, and we'll surely also keep you posted of progress there. But for now, yes, I just wanted to thank you for hosting these, and colleagues Nick and Frida for joining this panel with me. It's been very nice, as always, to have a bigger back and forth on this issue. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks. So maybe to add a last piece of thoughts on this idea of what actors might also bring interesting new ideas to the table. I think in one of our projects where we're working with CARICOM in the Caribbean, we're hearing a lot of concern from that region in terms of the public health impact of gun violence, and basically with new types of weapons circulating, and accessories like conversion devices that we haven't talked about, but items that can convert a firearm into a fully automatic firearm. And there are cases that are being documented more and more in that region that also has an impact, on the public health responders. They're seeing patients with multiple wounds, and they're also interested, obviously in the prevention aspect of that. So I think, it's also another potential stakeholder to consider for certain aspects of that discussion. I think we really look forward as the SMARM survey to support those discussions with what we learn also from different regions. And we, of course, stand ready to be in touch with all of you, all the participants, and also the UN colleagues here and NGO colleagues. So thanks very much, Jeff and Mona Lisa, for organizing, and we look forward to the next steps.
And I can go last. Thank you also to Mona Lisa and Jeff for hosting this, and to Matilda and Nicholas for all the expertise. I mean, I've learned a lot personally, so this is extremely helpful. And from UNODA side, we're also really looking forward to engage with any participants here, and especially in with the process of the open and the technical expert groups. Any ideas and thoughts are also welcome, and how we can make sure that that's a good process, and that this group can really achieve some results and tackle the issues we've discussed today. So always welcome any engagement, and looking forward to continue working with everyone. So thanks again.
As we conclude today's webinar, I would, of course, first like to extend sincere gratitude to all our panelists for their time and their expertise, and also to all our participants for your active engagement. The intersection of technology and small arms and light weapons control is a dynamic and evolving field, and it's imperative that we continue these discussions, fostering collaboration and innovation to address the challenges and harness the opportunities that lie ahead. With that, I would like to kindly ask for your feedback to help us improve future sessions via the link to a brief survey, which should be available in the chat now. I believe Jeff is in the back end to help us with the link. Your responses are greatly appreciated. Additionally, we will be following up with all our registered participants via email, providing access to the webinar recording and also supplementary resources that were discussed today. Thank you, and we look forward to your continued participation in future discussion.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.